To understand the economic evolution of Japan is to witness one of the most remarkable stories of survival, adaptation, and state-directed transformation in human history. For the general public, the story of Japan's economy is often reduced to simplified milestones: isolated samurai, a post-war manufacturing miracle, and a high-tech modern society that is currently struggling with an aging population. However, a deeper look reveals a fascinating and unbroken thread of strategic cooperation between the government and private business. From the feudal era to the modern age of global supply chains, Japan's political economy has not been driven by the purely free market principles seen in the West. Instead, it has been shaped by existential threats, intense geopolitical pressures, and a unique institutional architecture where the state and the market work hand in hand. This deep dive analysis traces how these unique state-market relations have driven Japan's evolution across 5 distinct historical eras. A persistent historical myth is that Japan was a backward, sleeping society that was suddenly jolted into the modern age by the arrival of American gunboats in the mid-19th century. In reality, the profound economic leaps of modern Japan were made possible by the complex social and economic structures established during the Tokugawa or Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1867. During this era, Japan was a feudal state ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate, which enforced a strict national seclusion from the outside world. While the emperor remained a powerless figurehead in Kyoto, the actual governance was decentralized, divided between the central military government, the bakufu, and roughly 270 regional feudal lords, daimyo, who ruled their own territories. Despite this political fragmentation and isolation, Japan enjoyed 2.5 centuries of continuous internal peace, which acted as an incubator for proto-industrialization. The shogunate required all regional lords to spend alternating years in the capital city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, a system that forced massive internal movement and urbanization. To fund these expensive journeys, regional lords had to convert their agricultural wealth, primarily rice, into cash. This necessity gave rise to a highly sophisticated, nationally integrated economy, complete with complex financial instruments, deeply developed transportation networks, and a flourishing merchant class. By removing intermediate power groups like independent manorial landlords and autonomous Buddhist temples, the state centralized authority and tax collection, driving commercialization deep into the countryside. Consequently, agricultural techniques saw slow but steady improvements, and literacy rates soared, laying a foundation of human capital that would be vital for the coming industrial age. This stable proto-industrial society was violently disrupted by the arrival of foreign powers in the 1850s. The 19th century was an era of European imperialism and scientific racism, where heavily armed Western nations aggressively expanded their influence across Asia. When the shogunate proved entirely incapable of resisting the unequal trade treaties forced upon them by the West, massive domestic outrage erupted. Intellectuals like Yoshida Shoin hatched plans to overthrow the military government under the rallying cry, "Revere the Emperor, expel the barbarians." This anti-foreign sentiment rapidly evolved into a sophisticated political revolution led by younger samurai from the Choshu and Satsuma domains. Following a brief civil war, the shogunate was abolished, and supreme authority was returned to the emperor in 1868, an event known as the Meiji Restoration. The new Meiji leaders quickly realized that they could not literally expel the barbarians with swords. They needed to beat the Western powers at their own industrial game. To resist the existential threat of European imperialism, they launched a radical state-led modernization program unified by the national slogan Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the armed forces. The government recognized that building a military capable of protecting the nation required a robust industrial economy, and they took immediate control of the modernization process. The Meiji state acted as the primary investor and entrepreneur of this new era, building railways, telegraph networks, and state-owned pilot factories in sectors like textiles, shipbuilding, and mining. However, recognizing that the state could not fund these enterprises forever without bankrupting the treasury, the government changed strategy in the 1880s. They sold off these state-owned industries at heavily discounted prices to a small group of trusted, politically connected merchants and former samurai families. This massive transfer of national wealth gave birth to the Zaibatsu, colossal family-controlled financial and industrial cliques. Firms like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Sumitomo became the engines of Japanese capitalism. By owning their own banks, these Zaibatsu solved the severe capital shortage of the early industrial period, allowing them to cross-subsidize new technological ventures. The economy grew in a dualistic manner. Traditional agricultural sectors and young farm girls working in textile mills provided the capital and export earnings that funded the rapid growth of heavy manufacturing. By the end of the Meiji period in 1912, Japan had not only preserved its independence, but had become a world power, successfully defeating both China and Russia in major wars and establishing the foundational blueprint of state-guided monopoly capitalism. The successes of the Meiji era elevated Japan to the top tier of global powers, but the intense pressures of managing a growing empire eventually warped Japan's political economy. The early 20th century initially saw a period of liberalization known as the Taisho democracy, where party politicians gained influence over the military and the country briefly embraced cooperative international diplomacy and liberal capitalism. However, the global economic devastation of the Great Depression, combined with the rise of protectionist trade barriers across the West, deeply isolated Japan. In response, the nation's leadership drastically shifted towards militarism and the pursuit of economic autarky, a system where the country would be entirely self-sufficient and independent of global trade.
This shift was heavily inspired by European fascism, particularly the models of German militarism and state-directed capitalism. A new generation of technocrats, known as the reform bureaucrats, believed that free market capitalism was too chaotic and selfish to support a modern empire. Instead, they advocated for a planned techno-fascist economy, drawing heavily from the theories of German economists like Werner Sombart, who criticized liberal capitalism and envisioned a centrally organized society. The primary laboratory for this radical new economic model was the puppet state of Manchukuo, established after the Japanese military invaded Manchuria in 1931. In Manchuria, the reform bureaucrats, led by figures such as future Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, drafted comprehensive 5-year plans to rapidly build heavy and chemical industries. They pioneered the concept of separating the ownership of a company from its management, stripping traditional shareholders of their power so that state planners could direct corporate resources purely toward national expansion rather than private profit. The young military officers and bureaucrats observed this massive mobilization of resources and saw it as a shortcut to immense national wealth and power. As Japan's war in China escalated in 1937, the authoritarian economic policies tested in Manchuria were imported directly back to the Japanese home islands. The military and the state essentially merged. To ensure absolute maximization of industrial output for the war effort, the government passed the National Mobilization Law in 1938. This legislation effectively ended the free market in Japan. The state was granted sweeping powers to direct civilian labor, freeze wages, set prices, and heavily ration consumer goods. To enforce these mandates at the local level, the government established neighborhood associations, known as tonarigumi, which distributed rations and conducted surveillance on citizens to ensure compliance. Consumer industries were deliberately starved of resources, and the production of civilian goods plummeted. Meanwhile, the giant Zaibatsu conglomerates were forcefully integrated into the military-industrial complex. In 1943, to further consolidate control over these companies, the government created the Ministry of Munitions. Directed by Nobusuke Kishi under the administration of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, this new super-ministry nationalized key industries. Corporate executives were essentially drafted and given the status of government officials, while factory workers were treated as conscripted labor, forbidden from striking or quitting. The state-controlled banks provided endless capital, and the entire society was put to work under the grim principle of guns before butter.
While this immense command economy eventually collapsed under the weight of Allied bombing and naval blockades, the institutional mechanisms, bureaucratic networks, and economic planning concepts forged during this dark era would unexpectedly become the blueprints for Japan's post-war resurrection. The period spanning Japan's surrender in 1945 to the bursting of the asset bubble in 1989 is widely heralded as the Japanese economic miracle. Over these 4 decades, Japan rose from the ashes of total devastation to become the world's second-largest economy. Remarkably, with almost no natural resources, Japan managed to rapidly catch up to the United States and Europe in high-technology manufacturing, while maintaining a highly equal distribution of income among its citizens. This phenomenal success was not the result of American-style free market capitalism, nor was it a Soviet-style communist command economy. Instead, it was driven by the architecture of the developmental state, a hybrid model famously identified by political scientist Chalmers Johnson. In a developmental state, the government intervenes heavily in the economy, not to own the factories, but to strategically guide private business toward national goals of economic advancement. The deep irony of Japan's post-war miracle is its direct, unbroken lineage to the wartime command economy. When the American occupation forces arrived, they aggressively dismantled the Japanese military and ordered the breakup of the Zaibatsu conglomerates, viewing them as the financial engines of Japanese imperialism. However, as the Cold War began, the United States desperately needed Japan to become a strong capitalist shield against Soviet communism in Asia. To rebuild the economy quickly, the Americans left the Japanese civil service and economic bureaucracy largely intact. The formidable Ministry of Munitions, which had commanded the war economy, was simply reorganized, purged of its most overt militarists, and rebranded as the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. MITI became the brain of the developmental state. Operated by an elite, highly educated, and fiercely autonomous group of meritocratic bureaucrats, MITI protected young domestic industries from foreign competition while they grew strong. The ministry used an array of powerful tools, allocating scarce foreign currency to favored companies, creating research cartels so competing companies could share technological breakthroughs, and providing massive tax incentives. However, industrial planning required capital. This was managed jointly by the Ministry of Finance, MOF, and the Bank of Japan, BOJ, which maintained absolute control over the country's financial system. Post-war Japan deliberately engineered a system that encouraged regular citizens to save vast amounts of money while aggressively discouraging them from borrowing. For example, consumer banking services were kept intentionally poor. Banks rarely offered personal loans, checking accounts for individuals were virtually non-existent, and ATM machines closed early in the evening. All of these citizen savings were pooled into the banking system, which the Bank of Japan then directed to strategic corporate sectors. The Bank of Japan utilized a powerful informal mechanism known as window guidance. Under this system, central bank officials would literally stand at the teller windows and instruct private banks on exactly how much credit they were allowed to extend and specifically which industries should receive it. This non-market credit rationing ensured that money flowed cheaply and abundantly to heavy industries like steel, shipbuilding, and automobiles, while starving consumer sectors. While the family-controlled holding companies of the Zaibatsu had been outlawed, Japanese businesses quickly found a new way to cooperate, forming horizontal alliances known as keiretsu. A keiretsu was a massive network of independent companies, usually spanning manufacturing, trading, and logistics, all clustered around a massive central bank. To protect themselves from foreign corporate raiders and the pressures of the stock market, these companies bought large portions of each other's shares, a practice called cross-shareholding. Because their shares were locked up with friendly allies, corporate executives didn't have to worry about short-term quarterly profits or impatient shareholders. Instead, they could focus entirely on what MITI wanted: long-term technological development and capturing global market share. The political stability required for this long-term planning was provided by the Iron Triangle, a deeply entrenched alliance between the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, the elite government bureaucracy, and big business. The LDP, which ruled almost entirely without interruption from 1955 onward, provided a consistently pro-business legislative environment. Big business funded the politicians, and the politicians delegated the actual drafting of laws and economic plans to the bureaucracy. This cooperative alliance was cemented by a uniquely Japanese practice known as amakudari, or descent from heaven. When senior bureaucrats retired from government service in their 50s, they routinely descended into highly paid executive positions at the very private corporations they used to regulate. This revolving door created a tight-knit web of informal communication and reciprocal consent between the state and the private sector, allowing them to coordinate industrial strategies seamlessly. Finally, social harmony and equitable wealth distribution were achieved using unique structural features in the labor market. In the chaotic years immediately following the war, the government and corporate leaders were terrified of communist labor uprisings. To ensure stability, they forged an implicit social contract with the workforce, the system of lifetime employment and enterprise unionism. For the core male workforce of the large keiretsu firms, a job was essentially guaranteed from graduation until retirement. Instead of joining national trade unions that might organize industry-wide strikes, workers joined unions dedicated solely to their specific company. This aligned the interests of the workers entirely with the long-term survival of the firm. In return for absolute loyalty and grueling hours, corporations provided extensive on-the-job training, steady wage increases, and comprehensive welfare benefits, ensuring social stability without the need for a massive state-funded welfare system. The tragic irony of the Japanese economic model is that the very institutional structures that created the miracle eventually triggered their undoing. By the 1980s, the developmental state had succeeded brilliantly. Japan had caught up to the West in technology and manufacturing. However, this meant that the state's strategy of copying and improving foreign technology was no longer viable. Furthermore, Japan's massive export success created severe political friction with the United States. In 1985, under intense American pressure, Japan signed the Plaza Accord, agreeing to let the value of the Japanese yen rise significantly to reduce trade imbalances. A stronger yen made Japanese exports much more expensive abroad, threatening the core manufacturing sector. To save the exporters and stimulate domestic demand, the Bank of Japan aggressively slashed interest rates and vastly expanded the money supply. Relying on their traditional tool of window guidance, the central bank commanded commercial banks to dramatically increase their lending. However, Japan's industrial corporations were already mature, profitable, and cash-rich. They didn't need massive new loans to build factories. Consequently, this flood of free money was instead poured into rampant speculation in the real estate and stock market. This triggered one of the most spectacular financial bubbles in history. By the late 1980s, the paper value of the land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was famously said to be worth more than all the real estate in the entire state of California. Stock prices became completely disconnected from economic reality. Realizing that the euphoria was dangerously out of control, the Bank of Japan abruptly hit the brakes, severely tightening monetary policy and raising interest rates. The result was an uncontrolled, devastating crash that began in December 1980. From 1990 to 1992, the Nikkei 225 stock index plummeted by a staggering 60%, and real estate valuations went into a catastrophic freefall.
Ordinary Japanese citizens who had taken out massive, multi-generational mortgages to buy homes were suddenly trapped under exorbitant debt. Likewise, the balance sheets of the mighty keiretsu corporations were left holding trillions of yen in worthless paper assets. The immediate reaction of the government and the financial sector was disastrously slow. Guided by the cooperative norms of the Iron Triangle, the government's initial strategy was forbearance. Believing that the economy would naturally recover, the Ministry of Finance allowed banks to hide their massive losses and avoid publicly reporting their non-performing, unpayable loans. Instead of forcing bankrupt companies to close, banks continued to lend them just enough money to pay the interest on their existing debts. This policy created an entire economy of zombie corporations, companies that were technically dead but kept artificially alive by banks. The massive general construction industry, employing millions, became a classic example of this dynamic. These zombie firms dragged down the entire country. They hoarded labor, perpetuated massive overcapacity, and prevented healthy, innovative companies from getting the funding they needed to grow. Furthermore, the system of cross-shareholding, which had once protected companies, now acted as an anchor. Because banks owned shares in the failing companies and the companies owned shares in the failing banks, the collapse of stock prices continuously destroyed the core capital of the entire financial system. The systemic rot finally broke the surface in 1997, triggering a full-blown banking crisis. The public, previously unaware of the depth of the rot, watched in shock as massive financial institutions began to collapse. In November of that year, the Hokkaido Takushoku Bank, one of the largest banks in northern Japan, Zanyo Securities, and the venerable Yamaichi Securities all failed in rapid succession. The global financial market panicked, imposing a Japan premium that forced Japanese banks to borrow money internationally at higher interest rates. The interbank lending market froze completely. This crisis ushered in a period of severe economic and political paralysis, known as the Lost Decades. The government was eventually forced to use trillions of yen in highly unpopular taxpayer funds to bail out and nationalize the banking sector. As a result, the legendary prestige of the state bureaucracy was permanently shattered, leading to the gradual breakdown of the Iron Triangle. Corporations were forced to painfully unwind their cross-shareholdings to survive. Compounding the misery was a newly emerging structural nightmare, an aging population. As fewer young people entered the workforce and more elderly citizens retired, domestic demand dried up. Japan fell into a stubborn, persistent cycle of deflation, falling prices, and stagnant wages that paralyzed economic growth throughout the 1990s and 2000s. By 2012, Japan found itself locked in a deeply pessimistic holding pattern. The country was suffering from 2 decades of deflation, a rapidly shrinking workforce, and the devastating lingering aftermath of the 2011 Fukushima earthquake and nuclear disaster. It was in this atmosphere of national crisis that Shinzo Abe returned to the Prime Minister's office, bringing with him a bold, comprehensive economic revival plan popularly known as Abenomics. The primary goal of Abenomics was to physically shock the country out of its deflationary mindset and restart the engine of growth. The Abenomics strategy was built on 3 distinct policy pillars, famously described as the 3 arrows. The first arrow was an aggressively bold monetary policy. Under a new Bank of Japan governor, the central bank essentially opened the floodgates, printing unprecedented amounts of money to deliberately weaken the value of the yen. A weaker yen made Japanese exports highly competitive on the global market again, resulting in surging corporate profits and a massive boom in the stock market. The second arrow was flexible fiscal stimulus. The government initiated massive public spending projects to rebuild infrastructure damaged by the earthquake and stimulate demand, although this was occasionally undermined when the government was forced to raise consumer taxes to manage the country's soaring national debt. The third arrow, which was deemed the most crucial for long-term survival, focused on deep structural reforms to unlock new growth. A major component of this was Womenomics, an active push to increase female participation in the workforce through better childcare support and corporate reforms. While Abenomics succeeded in ending the worst of the deflationary spiral and brought millions of women and seniors into the labor market, it struggled to dramatically increase wages or overall worker productivity. Today, the contemporary Japanese political economy is fighting a battle on 2 distinct fronts: an internal demographic collapse and an increasingly hostile external geopolitical environment. Domestically, Japan is experiencing a hyper-aging society unlike anything seen in human history. The rapid growth of the retired population has placed enormous strain on social welfare expenses, while simultaneously causing crippling labor shortages across vital industries such as agriculture, nursing care, and manufacturing. Recognizing that domestic reforms were no longer enough, the traditionally immigrant-resistant government enacted a major policy shift in 2019, creating the Specified Skilled Worker Program to bring hundreds of thousands of foreign workers into the country, though integration remains a complex challenge. Simultaneously, the country is grappling with an acute energy security crisis. The 2011 Fukushima Daiichi accident shattered the public's trust in nuclear power, leading to the suspension of the entire fleet of nuclear reactors. Because Japan possesses almost no fossil fuels of its own, the country was forced to massively increase imports of expensive coal, oil, and natural gas. Today, national energy policy is strictly governed by the S+3E doctrine: safety, energy security, economic efficiency, and environment. Balancing these demands is incredibly difficult. On one hand, Japan has committed to international decarbonization targets. To achieve this, the government launched the Green Transformation Initiative, aiming to mobilize 150 trillion yen over 10 years through state-backed transition bonds and carbon pricing schemes. However, the transition to renewable energy, like solar and wind, is severely hindered by Japan's mountainous geography, deep coastal waters, and the immense political power of the traditional utility monopolies, who prefer large, centralized power plants. Facing a massive projected spike in electricity demand driven by artificial intelligence and data centers, the government is controversially pushing to restart dormant nuclear reactors and is investing heavily in technologies that co-fire fossil fuels with ammonia, a strategy critics argue is designed to protect the legacy assets of traditional industrial conglomerates. Most fundamentally, the global environment that allowed Japan to flourish as a peaceful trading nation is fracturing. As strategic competition and economic decoupling between the United States and China intensify, the global supply chains that Japanese manufacturers rely on have become heavily weaponized. In response, the Japanese state has aggressively revived the spirit of the old developmental state, this time not purely on export dominance, but on national survival and geoeconomic security. This shift was codified in the 2022 Economic Security Promotion Act, ESPA, which designates certain technologies as critical to the survival of the state and actively directs private businesses to secure their supply chains against foreign coercion. The clearest example of this new strategy is the massive state-funded revitalization of the domestic semiconductor industry. Decades after losing its 1980s dominance in microchips, Japan is pouring billions of dollars in subsidies. Rather than trying to do it entirely on its own, Japan is pursuing a strategy of friendshoring, collaborating deeply with international allies. The Japanese government has provided enormous financial incentives to lure the Taiwanese chip giant TSMC to build advanced factories in Kumamoto, embedding Japan deeply into regional technology networks. At the same time, the state has backed a new domestic consortium called Rapidus to chase next-generation chip manufacturing and heavily subsidized domestic champions like Sony to maintain their global dominance in critical components like image sensors. By closely aligning its technology and export control policies with the United States and other democracies, Japan is striving to make itself utterly indispensable to the global high-tech economy, utilizing its mastery of state-market cooperation to build a protective shield against the turbulent geopolitics of the 21st century.